Wind clawed, dust down Redemption Creek's Main Street. Silas Thorne stood apart, the auction block's rough timber stark before him. 3 figures huddled there, girls, young, Chinese, eyes wide with terror in the prairie glare. The auctioneer's call scraped the air. What could a broken man do against such darkness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've got something extra special saved just for you. The gavel's first crack split the brittle afternoon air like shod hooves on frozen mud. Silas Thorne flinched, the sound finding the hollow ache behind his ribs where grief had carved its permanent home. Margaret. Her name was a ghost on the wind that snatched at his worn duster. Before the hastily erected platform, the crowd of settlers and prospectors shifted, a restless beast smelling blood and cheap labor. Lot number 1, bellowed the auctioneer, Jedediah Pike, his voice thick with false cheer. He wore a suit that strained at the seams, sweat gleaming on his florid face. Healthy specimen, strong back, good for laundry, field work, whatever a man requires. He gestured crudely towards the smallest girl. She couldn't have been more than 14. Dirt smudged her thin cheeks, her dark hair tangled. Her eyes, enormous and dark as obsidian, darted frantically, seeing only predators. She trembled violently, shrinking back against the taller girl beside her. That one stood rigid, 16 perhaps. Her jaw was set, a fierce, desperate defiance burning in her narrowed eyes despite the tremor Silas could see in her clenched fists resting on her threadbare tunic. She stared straight ahead, past the leering faces, focusing on some distant point on the horizon where the bleached bones of the prairie met the hard blue sky. The third girl, caught between them in age, seemed carved from ice. Utterly still, her expression was a mask of terrifying blankness. Only her eyes moved, flicking with unnerving precision over the crowd, assessing, calculating. Silas noted the way her fingers, hidden within her sleeves, might be clutching something small and hard. A shard of pottery? A stone? A weapon of despair. Do I hear $5? $5 for a sturdy little worker. A ripple of coarse laughter. A man near the front, stinking of cheap whiskey and stale sweat, spat tobacco juice onto the dusty ground near the platform. Ain't worth the feed, Pike. Skinny little things. More laughter. Silas felt the familiar, leaden weight of isolation press down. Redemption Creek tolerated him, the widower rancher from the High Valley, because he paid his debts and kept himself. But this was a sickness in the town's gut, laid bare. He saw Margaret's face again, not in the sharp pain of memory, but in the blurred reflection of the girl's terror. The helplessness. The day the fever took her, a different kind of auction, life bartered away by an uncaring universe. His hand, calloused and scarred from rope and rain, tightened on the saddle horn of his patient bay gelding, Samson. $3 then. $3 for a lifetime of service. The defiant girl flinched, a crack in her armor. The smallest whimpered, a sound like a wounded bird. The silent one's eyes locked on his Silas for a fleeting, unnerving second. Ancient, knowing and utterly lost. It wasn't pity that surged in him then. It was a raw, furious recognition. This was Margaret's legacy, not the quiet sorrow of the ranch, but this refusal to let helplessness win. A spark ignited in the cold ashes of his grief. $10. His voice, gravelly from disuse and dust, cut through the murmur. It wasn't loud, but it landed with the force of a thrown stone. Head swiveled. Jedediah Pike's eyebrows shot up. The drunkard squinted, confused. $10, Mr. Thorne? Pike chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. For this one, he pointed at the trembling child. For all three, Silas kept his gaze level on Pike, ignoring the stares prickling his skin like burrs. The words felt alien, reckless. He had enough coin, saved meticulously for winter supplies, repairs to the north pasture fence. enough to buy 3 lives condemned to hell. The ledger in his mind screamed folly. His heart, a muscle-long atrophied, gave a single, painful thud. Silence. Then a wave of muttering. Thorn's gone soft in the head since his missus passed. Someone hissed, not quietly enough. Buying chinks? What's he aim to do with them? Another voice, thick with suspicion. Ain't natural. Pike recovered, a predatory gleam replacing his surprise. Well now, generous spirit, Mr. Thorn. $10 for the lot? Seems low for such potential. Do I hear 15? Silas didn't hesitate. 20. It was most of his ready coin. The winter would be lean. The risk immense. Pike scanned the crowd. No counteroffer came. The novelty? Disgust? Or simply the sight of Silas's stony face? The grim set of his shoulders beneath the worn leather? Pike shrugged, a theatrical gesture. Sold to Silas Thorn for $20. A charitable gesture. Folks, mark my words. Charity. The word curdled in Silas's mouth. He dismounted, the leather creaking loud in the sudden quiet. He approached the platform, the crowd parting reluctantly before him, their stares hot and hostile. He avoided the girl's eyes as he counted out the coins into Pike's outstretched, greedy palm. The metal felt cold, lifeless. Pike handed him a slip of paper, a bill of sale, crude and obscene. Silas crumpled it into his pocket without looking. "They're yours, Thorn," Pike said, his voice dropping, losing its false cheer. "Hope you know what you're doing." There was a warning there, veiled but sharp. Silas turned to the girls. The defiant one met his gaze, her chin still high, but confusion warring with the fear in her eyes. The silent one watched him, unblinking. The smallest had buried her face in the defiant one's sleeve, trembling uncontrollably. "Come," Silas said, his voice gruff but lacking the auctioneer's bark. He gestured towards Samson and the sturdy pack mule, Daisy, tethered nearby. He hadn't planned for passengers. He helped them down from the platform. Their lightness shocked him. They felt like bundles of dry twigs beneath the thin fabric. The smallest stumbled, and his hand shot out instinctively to steady her elbow. She recoiled as if burned, a tiny gasp escaping her. He withdrew his hand slowly. "No harm," he murmured, the words unfamiliar comfort. He gestured again towards the horses. Understanding dawned on the defiant girl. She spoke rapidly in a low, musical language to the others, herding them towards Daisy. The silent one moved with eerie grace, her eyes constantly scanning the hostile faces around them. The smallest clung to her. Silas mounted Samson. He didn't offer to help them onto the mule. They scrambled up with surprising agility born of necessity, the defiant one settling behind the smallest, pulling her close. The silent one perched lightly in front, her posture unervingly alert. As Silas nudged Samson forward, leading Daisy, the silence of the crowd was heavier than any shout. Eyes bored into his back, suspicious, contemptuous, calculating. He felt the weight of Jedediah Pike's stare and another, colder gaze he couldn't place. Near the saloon doors, a lean man with a scar bisecting his eyebrow leaned against a post, whittling a stick, his eyes narrowed on the departing group. Silas knew him, Harlan Teague, a man whose dealings skirted the edges of the law. Teague's lips curved in a humorless smirk. He didn't speak, but the message was clear: trouble. The journey to Hollow Rock Ranch was a slow, silent procession through the dying light. Dust devil-spun across the sagebrush flats. The wind, funneled by the rising bluffs ahead, carried the mournful cry of a coyote and the dry rattle of seed pods. Silas rode stiffly, his mind churning. What have I done? The practicalities loomed. Food, shelter, the boys. Elias, his eldest at 22, steady but burdened by the ranch's struggles since Margaret's death. Caleb, 19, quick-tempered and restless, chafing against the isolation. Jonah, 17, quiet like his father, finding solace in the horses and the high pastures. How would they react to this? To them? He risked a glance back. The girls were huddled together on Daisy's broad back. The defiant one had her arm protectively around the smallest, who seemed to have cried herself into an exhausted doze. The silent one sat rigidly upright, her gaze fixed on the vast, empty landscape, her face unreadable. Did they understand they weren't slaves? Did they trust his impulsive act any more than he did? Their silence was a wall. He thought of Margaret's laughter, bright as creek water over stones, now only an echo in the empty rooms of the ranch house. Had he brought these girls into another kind of desolation? The ranch revealed itself as dusk painted the sky in bruised purples and oranges. Nestled against a sheer, ochre-colored cliff face that gave it its name, Hollow Rock was a testament to stubborn endurance. The main house was built of rough-hewn timber and local stone, low-slung and solid against the elements. A large barn, its wood silvered by sun and wind, stood nearby, flanked by corrals holding a dozen head of cattle and a few horses. A chicken coop and a small vegetable garden, struggling against the harsh soil, completed the scene. Smoke curled thinly from the chimney, Jonah likely starting supper. The air smelled of dust, pine resin from the higher slopes, and wood smoke. As they rode into the yard, the door of the house banged open. Elias emerged first, wiping his hands on a rag, his brow furrowed in surprise that quickly hardened into suspicion as he saw the girls. Caleb followed, leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression openly skeptical, his eyes raking over the unexpected arrivals. Jonah appeared behind them, his gaze curious but guarded, lingering on the silent girl's unnerving stillness. Silas dismounted, the crunch of gravel under his boots loud in the sudden quiet of the yard. The girl slid down from Daisy, the smallest swaying slightly on her feet, held upright by the defiant one. They stood in a tight cluster, facing the three young men, their faces pale in the twilight. "Pa!" Elias's voice was tight, controlled. "What's this?" Silas met his eldest son's gaze. He saw Margaret in the shape of Elias's eyes, the set of his jaw. It was a physical ache. "Brought help," Silas stated, his voice rougher than he intended. He gestured vaguely toward the girls. "For the homestead." Caleb snorted, a harsh, dismissive sound. "Help? That kind?" His gaze lingered on the girls with a mixture of disbelief and something uglier. The defiant girl stiffened, her chin lifting, meeting his stare with a spark of her own fire. The silent girl's eyes flickered to Caleb, then away, dismissive. The smallest shrank further behind the others. Jonah stepped forward slightly, his voice quiet. "They look tired, Pa." He looked at the smallest girl, her exhaustion palpable. "Hungry, maybe?" "Inside," Silas said, ignoring Caleb's glare. He couldn't explain. Not here, not now, under the weight of his son's confusion and the girl's palpable terror. "Get them inside." "Jonah, see to the horses." He moved towards the house, not looking back, trusting Elias's sense of duty, however reluctant, would prevail for now. The kitchen was warm, lit by a single kerosene lamp and the glow from the iron stove where a pot of beans simmered. The familiar smells, wood smoke, coffee, leather oil, usually brought a sliver of comfort. Tonight, they felt thin, inadequate against the strangeness filling the room. The girls hovered just inside the doorway, a small island of fear and exhaustion. Silas gestured woodenly towards the scarred oak table. "Sit." Elias followed them in, his expression stormy. Caleb lingered in the doorway, blocking it, radiating hostility. Jonah slipped past him, heading back outside towards the barn. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the ragged breathing of the smallest girl. Silas busied himself fetching tin plates, his movements stiff. He ladled beans onto 3 plates, the simple act feeling monumental. He placed them on the table, pushing them towards the girls. The food steamed, a basic offering that felt like a fragile bridge across an impossible chasm. The defiant girl looked from the food to Silas, then to Elias and Caleb. Hunger warred with deep, ingrained distrust. The silent girl watched the steam rise, her expression unchanging. The smallest stared at the plate, tears welling silently. "Eat," Silas said, the word sounding more like an order than he meant. He poured water into tin cups, the splash loud. Caleb finally spoke, his voice tight with anger. "Pa, you can't just bring them here. Bought them? Like cattle? What are you thinking? What's the town gonna say?" He took a step further into the room, his presence looming. "They ain't staying." The defiant girl flinched at his tone. The silent girl's hand, resting in her lap, clenched into a fist so tight her knuckles turned white. Silas saw it. He straightened, facing his middle son. The weariness in his bones warred with a sudden, cold determination. "They're here," he stated flatly. "My decision. Your decision drags trouble onto this ranch." Caleb shot back, his voice rising. Elias put a hand on his brother's arm, but Caleb shook it off. "We got enough problems without harboring strays the whole town despises. Who are they? What are they even for?" The question hung in the air, brutal and exposing. What are they for? Silas hadn't thought beyond the auction block, beyond the crushing weight of their helplessness mirroring his own. He opened his mouth, no answer ready, only the echo of Margaret's absence and the memory of that silent girl's ancient, knowing eyes. Suddenly, a sound cut through the tension, not from the room but from outside. A sharp, splintering crack, like dry wood breaking under immense pressure. It came from the direction of the old tack room, a small, disused storage shed tucked beside the barn. Silas froze. Everyone in the kitchen froze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was the distinct sound of something breaking. Jonah was still out there. Before Silas could move, before Caleb could voice another angry retort, the silent girl did something extraordinary. Her head snapped towards the sound, her mask of indifference shattering. Her eyes widened, not with fear, but with a sudden, sharp intensity. She sucked in a breath, a tiny, audible hiss. Her gaze locked onto Silas, and for the first time, he saw something raw and urgent beneath the ice. It wasn't directed at him, or Caleb, or the room. It was focused entirely on the source of that sound, a sound that seemed to resonate with something deep within her, or perhaps something deep within the bones of Hollow Rock itself. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the intensity vanished, replaced by a flicker of something else. Recognition? Dread? She looked down at her clenched fist, then slowly, deliberately, opened her hand. Silas glimpsed it for a fraction of a second before her fingers closed again. A small, intricately carved figure, dark wood polished smooth by desperate fingers. A coiled serpent, its tiny eyes seeming to gleam in the lamplight. The crack from outside echoed again, fainter this time, followed by the frantic whinny of a horse from the corral. Jonah. The fragile piece of the kitchen shattered completely. Caleb swore, turning towards the door. Elias reached for the rifle leaning by the hearth. The defiant girl pulled the smallest one closer, her own fear momentarily forgotten in the face of this new, unknown threat. The silent girl closed her eyes for a heartbeat, clutching the serpent carving, her face pale as bone. Silas Thorne moved, his grief momentarily eclipsed by a surge of protective dread colder than a mountain wind. He lunged for the door, the girls forgotten, the confrontation with his sons suspended. Something was wrong, deeply, unervingly wrong at Hollow Rock, and it had announced itself with the sound of breaking wood and the silent girl's carved serpent. Trouble hadn't just followed him from town, it had been waiting. The silence after the cracking sound was thicker than the frost already forming on the window panes. Silas Thorne's lunge for the door wasn't thought. It was pure instinct, a primal surge that momentarily drowned the grief and the impossible weight of the girl's presence. Jonah. The name was a hammer blow against his ribs. Elias was a half step behind him, the rifle forgotten in his sudden urgency. Caleb, momentarily stunned out of his anger, hesitated, his gaze flicking between the terrified girls huddled together and the door his father and brother had just vanished through. The defiant girl? May, Silas's mind supplied the name Pike had carelessly tossed out, tightened her protective arm around the trembling Shio. But it was Ling, the silent one, who held Silas's attention for a fractured second. Her face was bloodless, her eyes wide pools of dark water reflecting the flickering lamplight. Not fear, he realized with a jolt, but a chilling, focused awareness. Her fist was clenched tight again, the serpent carving hidden, but her entire being vibrated with an intensity directed solely towards the source of that sound. Silas burst into the frigid twilight, Elias close on his heels. The yard was bathed in deepening indigo, the ochre cliff face a looming shadow. The frantic whinny came again, sharper now, from the corral near the barn. But Silas's attention snapped left to the small, ramshackle structure leaning precariously against the barn's weathered side, the old tack room. Its door, usually warped but latched, hung slightly ajar. A jagged line of darkness split the opening. "Jonah," Elias called, his voice tight with worry, scanning the yard. No sign of his youngest brother. Silas approached the tack room, his boots crunching on the frozen gravel. The air smelled of snow, pine, and the sharp tang of splintered wood. He pushed the door wider, the hinges shrieking in protest. The interior was pitch black, thick with the smell of dust, old leather, and rodent droppings. Shapes loomed, discarded harnesses hanging like spectral figures, broken wagon wheels, piles of burlap sacks gone brittle with age. "Pa!" Jonah's voice came from deeper inside, shaky but unheard. Relief washed over Silas, cold and brief. A lantern beam cut through the gloom as Elias lifted the one he'd snatched from a kitchen. The light wobbled, revealing Jonah standing amidst the debris, staring at the far wall. His face was pale, his eyes wide. At his feet lay a heavy wooden crate, shattered as if dropped from a height. Its contents, rusted tools, coils of stiff rope, spilled across the dirt floor. But it wasn't the crate that held their gaze. Above it, on the rough-hewn wall where the crate had presumably fallen from a high, precarious stack, a section of ancient, dried mud chinking between the logs had been knocked loose. Behind it, partially revealed, was a recess, and nestled within that shadowed hollow, catching the lantern light with a dull gleam, was an object. It was a small, cylindrical tin, perhaps 6 inches long, its once bright paint faded and scarred, sealed with wax. But etched crudely into its side, unmistakable even under layers of grime, was a symbol, a serpent coiled upon itself, its head raised. Identical in form to the tiny carving Silas had glimpsed in Ling's hand moments before. Silas felt the blood drain from his face. The air in the cramped space grew colder, thinner. A memory, long buried under layers of sorrow, stirred. Margaret, years ago, pointing towards this very shed. "That old place gives me the shivers, Silas, like something's watching from the walls." He dismissed it as fancy. Now, the symbol of the serpent, hidden here and clutched by the silent girl who'd known the sound, meant something. "What is it, Pa?" Jonah breathed, his gaze fixed on the tin. "Don't touch it," Silas rasped, the command harsh. He stepped forward, his shadow swallowing the small recess. The serpent's etched eyes seemed to gleam in the lamplight. He reached out, not for the tin, but for the edges of the broken chinking, carefully pulling away more of the dried mud. The recess was shallow, just deep enough to hide the object. No note, no other markings. Just the serpent tin, cold and enigmatic. Who put it there? When? And why did Ling react to its disturbance as if struck? "Looks old," Elias murmured, his initial relief replaced by wary confusion. He scanned the room, the rifle now held loosely but ready. Crate just gave way. Maybe, Silas muttered, unconvinced. The stack had looked unstable for years. But the timing, the symbol, Ling's reaction, coincidence felt like a frayed rope holding too much weight. He carefully extracted the tin. It was surprisingly heavy. He tucked it inside his coat, against his chest. It felt cold, alien. Jonah, you all right? What happened? I was coming to check on Daisy's saddle sore. Jonah stammered, gesturing vaguely towards the barn. Heard the crack, louder than usual freeze snap. Came running, saw the door hinge and open, then the crate just collapsed off the pile. Like something shoved it. He shivered, not entirely from the cold. Spooked the horses something fierce. Silas nodded curtly. The explanation was plausible, yet the image of the serpent, etched and carved, pulsed in his mind. Bar this door proper. Nothing in here we need tonight. He turned, the tin a secret weight against his ribs, and led the way back to the house, the questions screaming silently in the frozen air. Inside, the tension hadn't dissipated. It had merely changed shape. Caleb stood near the stove, radiating simmering resentment, his gaze flicking suspiciously between the girls and the returning men. May had maneuvered Shio onto a stool near the warmth. The youngest girl was still trembling, but her tears had stopped, replaced by a wide-eyed exhaustion. May stood protectively beside her, her own fear masked by a brittle defiance. Ling sat rigidly at the table, her untouched plate of beans before her. Her eyes locked on Silas as he entered, then dropped immediately to his coat where the tin was hidden. Her hand, resting on her lap, clenched so tightly her knuckles were white again. She knew, or she suspected. Well, Caleb demanded, ignoring the girls. What was it? Jonah all right? Jonah's fine, Elias answered, his voice weary. Old crate fell in the tack room. Spooked the horses is all. Is all. Caleb echoed, his voice rising. He gestured violently towards the girls. And what about them? You bring trouble right into our home. Pennsylvania. First to town now weird sounds and God knows what else. His gaze landed accusingly on Ling. What's she staring at? What's she hiding? Ling didn't flinch. She met Caleb's glare with that unnerving stillness, her dark eyes unreadable pools. May stepped slightly in front of Shio, her chin lifting. We hide nothing, she stated, her English heavily accented but clear, laced with a defiance that surprised Silas. We are here. That is all. That's far from all, Caleb retorted, taking a step towards them. You don't belong here. You're going to bring down hell on this ranch. Caleb, Silas's voice cracked like a whip. The force of it, the raw authority he hadn't summoned in months, silenced the room. Even Caleb recoiled slightly. Enough. The single word hung heavy. He looked at the untouched food, at the exhaustion etched on every face, his sons, the girls. They stay. For now. We eat. Then we sleep. Tomorrow we figure the rest. He moved to the stove, refilling his own plate with beans he didn't want, a silent command for the others to do the same. The tin pressed coldly against his heart, a secret shared only with the silent girl whose gaze he could feel like a physical touch. Dawn broke brittle and gray over Hollow Rock Ranch, the promise of snow hanging heavy in the iron sky. The confrontation of the night before had settled into a thick, uneasy truce. Silas assigned tasks with curt efficiency, needing movement, purpose, anything to displace the chilling weight of the serpentine hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his bedroom. Elias, tight-lipped but dutiful, took Jonah to mend a fence line weakened by winter winds. Caleb, sullen and radiating resentment, was sent to check the cattle in the high pasture, as far from the house as possible. The girls remained in the kitchen. Silas met May's defiant gaze. Clean, he said simply, gesturing to the room. Warm water by the stove. He pointed toward the pile of worn burlap sacks. Mending. He He didn't know if they understood the words, but the intent was clear. Survival. Work. May nodded curtly. She moved first, gathering the tin plates from the night before with a brisk efficiency that spoke of hard labor. She spoke softly to Shio in their musical language, guiding the youngest girl towards the wash basin. Shio moved hesitantly, her eyes huge, flinching at sudden movements, but she began to scrub a plate under May's quiet instruction. Ling watched Silas for a long moment. Her expression remained unreadable, but her gaze held an unnerving intensity. It wasn't fear of him, he realized, but a watchfulness and assessment. Then, without a word, she picked up one of the burlap sacks and a bone needle threaded with coarse twine that had been left on the table. She sat by the small window where the weak light fell and began to mend a tear with swift, precise stitches. Her movements were economical, graceful. Her other hand stayed near the pocket of her thin tunic. Silas busied himself checking supplies in the lean-to pantry, giving them space, but acutely aware of their presence. He heard the scrape of a scrubbing brush, the slosh of water, the soft murmur between May and Shio. He watched Ling from the corner of his eye. Her focus on the mending was absolute, yet her posture remained alert, her head occasionally tilting as if listening to sounds beyond the wind sighing around the eaves. Was she listening for something specific? For another crack? For the whisper of scales? Later, needing air thick with something other than tension, Silas ventured to the barn to check on the horses. He found Jonah there, brushing down Samson with gentle strokes. The boy looked up, his expression troubled. "They're scared, Pa," Jonah said softly, nodding towards the house. "The little one, Shio," she jumped near out of her skin when a pot clanged. "And the quiet one, Ling, she watches everything, like a hawk." He paused, chewing his lip. "But may she's strong, like Mala's, in a different way." The unexpected comparison to Margaret struck Silas like a physical blow. He looked at Jonah, seeing his mother's empathy in the boy's eyes. "Just be kind, Jonah," Silas managed, his voice rough. "Don't push." Jonah nodded. "I will, Pa." He hesitated, then added, "Found something near the tack room this morning, after we barred it." He pulled a small object from his pocket, a button, brass, slightly tarnished, with an unusual, intricate knot design etched on its surface. It wasn't from any of their clothes. It was lying right by the door in the frost. Didn't notice it last night in the dark. Silas took the button. It felt cold, foreign. The design was unfamiliar, not local. Had it fallen from the intruder who might have disturbed the crate? Or was it simply lost ages ago? Another fragment of mystery. He pocketed it silently, the serpentine and Ling's carving forming a constellation of unease in his mind. The fragile rhythm of the day was shattered mid-afternoon. Silas was repairing a harness in the relative quiet of the barn when Elias returned early, his face grim. He carried something, a piece of coarse paper, roughly nailed to a splintered shingle. "Found this," Elias said, his voice tight, stuck to the gatepost at the end of the North Pasture Trail. He handed the shingle to Silas. Scrawled across the paper in thick, black charcoal were crude, menacing words. "Thorn. Send them back. Or burn." No signature, but the intent was as clear as the winter sky. The hostility from Redemption Creek wasn't just muttering. It was taking form. Silas felt a cold fury mix with the ever-present dread. Harlan Teague's smirking face flashed in his mind. Jedediah Pike's oily warning. He crumpled the paper in his fist. "Caleb, see this?" "Not yet," Elias said. "He's still up high with the cattle." He met his father's gaze. "What do we do, Pa?" Silas had no answer. The threat pulsed in his hand, as real as the serpent symbol hidden in his house. He looked towards a ranch house. Smoke curled peacefully from the chimney. Inside, 3 lost girls were trying to mend burlap sacks, scrub plates, exist in a place that didn't want them. He thought of Margaret's ghost in the tack room, Ling's ancient eyes, the crude message. Send them back, or burn. He was about to speak, to tell Elias to keep it quiet for now, when a sound froze the words in his throat. It wasn't a crack this time. It was a high, thin, blood-curdling scream. It ripped through the brittle air, coming from the direction of the vegetable garden behind the house. A girl's scream, filled with pure, unadulterated terror. Silas dropped the crumpled thread and the harness. He was running before he consciously willed his legs to move, Elias pounding behind him. His heart hammered against the secret tin hidden beneath the floorboards, against the image of the serpent, against the suffocating fear that the fragile safety of Hollow Rock had just been violently shattered. He rounded the corner of the house, dread a cold stone in his gut. The scene that greeted him stopped him dead. Shio stood rigid by the frost-bitten remains of the bean plants, her hands clamped over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror, silent now after that initial scream. May was beside her, pale but trying to pull the younger girl back. Ling stood a few feet apart, her body angled defensively, her face a mask of shock. At their feet, lying grotesquely on the frosted earth, was a dead jackrabbit. But it wasn't just dead. It had been meticulously, horrifyingly mutilated. Its throat was slit, the dark blood stark against the white fur of its chest, and arranged around its small body, forming a crude, unmistakable circle, were several smooth river stones. And coiled in the center of that circle, drawn in the same dark, sticky blood, was the symbol of the serpent. The silence after Shio's scream was a physical thing, thick and cold as the frozen earth beneath their feet. Silas Thorne's blood roared in his ears, momentarily drowning out the frantic hammering of his heart. The grotesque tableau in the frostbitten garden held him transfixed. The small, violated body of the jackrabbit, the circle of smooth, alien stones, the crude serpent drawn in its own dark blood. It was a message, stark and vicious, far more intimate than the charred thread on the gatepost. Shio whimpered, burying her face in May's shoulder. May held her tightly, her own face pale but set in hard lines, her eyes blazing with a fury that momentarily eclipsed her fear. She glared at the symbol, then at the surrounding wilderness, as if daring the unseen perpetrator to show themselves. Ling stood apart, rigid as ice. Her gaze wasn't fixed on the rabbit, but on the serpent symbol itself. Her hand had flown to the pocket where she kept her carving. Her expression was unreadable, but a tremor ran through her, subtle as a plucked wire. Silas saw it. Not just fear, but a chilling recognition, a resonance deeper than horror. God Almighty, Elias breathed, stepping forward, his face grim. He crouched near the circle, careful not to touch anything. Who would do this? The same bastards who nailed that note to the gate, Caleb snarled, appearing from around the house corner, his face flushed with cold and anger. He stopped short, taking in the scene, his eyes widening briefly before narrowing into slits. His gaze swept accusingly over the girls, lingering on Ling. Or maybe it's a warning from closer to home, he spat. That one's been clutching her witch mark since she got here. May whirled on him, her voice sharp as a whip crack. Ling is no witch. This is your people. Hateful. Cruel. She spat the words, her body shielding Shio and angling defensively towards Ling. Enough. Silas's voice cut through the rising tension, low and dangerous. He moved past Elias, ignoring the mutilated rabbit for the moment. He knelt before Shio, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he pried her trembling fingers from May's sleeve. The girl flinched but didn't pull away entirely. Her eyes, huge and filled with tears, met his. He saw Margaret's helplessness in the fever again, the terror of the auction block. No harm here now, Shio, he murmured, the unfamiliar words of comfort feeling rough on his tongue. Safe. He didn't know if she understood the word, but the intent, the low, steady tone, seemed to penetrate her terror. Her trembling subsided slightly. He glanced at May, a silent command to keep holding her. He rose, turning his attention back to the grim offering. The serpent symbol, crude yet unervingly similar to the one on the tin hidden beneath his floorboards and etched on Ling's carving. It felt like a key turning in a lock he couldn't see. Elias, Caleb, bury it, deep, out past the corral. His voice was flat, devoid of inflection, burying the fury and dread churning within. Scatter the stones. Scrape the earth clean here. Caleb looked ready to argue. His jaw clenched, but Elias caught his eye and gave a curt nod. Come on. Reluctantly, Caleb grabbed a shovel Elias retrieved from the barn wall. They worked in grim silence, Elias handling the small, stiff body with a detached care, Caleb shoveling dirt with violent jabs. Silas turned to Ling. She hadn't moved. Her dark eyes were fixed on the spot where the symbol had been, even as Elias scraped the blood-stained earth away. Ling, Silas said quietly. She didn't react. He reached out, not touching her, but gesturing towards the house. Inside, warm, her eyes flicked to his face, then back to the disturbed earth. For a fleeting second, he thought he saw a flicker of something else. Not fear, but a profound, weary sadness. Then the mask of stillness slid back into place. She turned silently and walked towards the house, May guiding the shaken Shio after her. Jonah emerged from the barn, drawn by the commotion, his face stricken as he took in the scene and the girls' retreating backs. Pa, help your brothers finish, Silas said, his voice tight. He needed to be alone. He needed to look at the tin. The weight of it beneath the floorboards seemed to pulse, a cold counterpoint to the heat of his anger. Back in the dim quiet of his small bedroom, Silas knelt by the loose floorboard. The cold metal of the tin felt alive in his hands, humming with secrets. He broke the brittle wax seal. Inside, protected from decades of dust and damp, lay a single folded sheet of thick, yellowed paper, covered in elegant, flowing script. Chinese characters. Silas couldn't read a word. Disappointment warred with a deeper unease. He carefully unfolded it, revealing not just writing, but a small, pressed flower tucked within the crease. Fragile, purple, long dead. And beneath the paper, nestled in the bottom, lay another object, a thin jade bracelet, cool and smooth, carved with a repeating pattern of interlocking serpents. The serpent motif was undeniable. It bound the hidden tin, Ling's carving, the bloody symbol in the garden, and now this delicate, ancient-looking bracelet. Margaret had hated that tack room. Had she known? Had she sensed this hidden piece of another life, another story buried within the logs of Hollow Rock? Was it connected to the ranch's past? To whoever built it before the Thorns? Or was it tied to the girls? To Ling specifically? Her intense reaction to the sound, her possession of the carving. The questions coiled in his mind like the serpents on a jade. He carefully refolded the paper, replaced the flower and the bracelet inside the tin, and sealed it again with a fresh dab of wax from his bedside candle. The secret felt heavier now, more dangerous. He slid the tin back into its hiding place, the serpent's eyes seeming to watch him from the darkness beneath the floor. The next days settled into a brittle, watchful rhythm, the shadow of the jackrabbit and the serpent symbol lying heavy over Hollow Rock. The threat was no longer abstract. It was written in blood on their land. Silas doubled the patrols of the perimeter, his movements tense, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line and the distant trail to town. He kept the rifle cleaned and close. The girls, however, began to carve out small spaces of purpose. Silas found May in the barn with Jonah, watching intently as he showed her how to mix the poultice for Daisy Saddlesore. May's brow was furrowed in fierce concentration, her earlier defiance channeled into learning. When Jonah offered her the rag to apply it, she took it without hesitation, her touch surprisingly gentle on the mare's flank. Jonah smiled faintly, a small bridge built over shared care for an animal. Silas assigned Ling the meticulous task of sorting and cleaning seeds salvaged from the summer's meager harvest for the spring planting. She worked at the kitchen table by the window, her movements precise, economical. She rarely looked up, but Silas noticed her eyes would occasionally dart towards the tack room or fix on a point in the distance, her head tilting almost imperceptibly. Listening, always listening. The serpent carving remained in her pocket, a constant, silent companion. Shio, still jumpy, shadowed May when she could. But Silas also saw Jonah patiently showing her how to collect eggs from the hen house, speaking softly, moving slowly. Once, when a hen flapped too close, Shio didn't scream. She just flinched and pressed closer to Jonah's side. He rested a reassuring hand on her small shoulder for a moment. A tiny spark of trust, fragile as the pressed flower in the tin. Caleb remained a storm cloud. He avoided the girls, his chores taking him far afield, his meals eaten quickly and in silence. His resentment festered, directed now not just at their presence, but at the palpable fear they'd brought, the extra work, the watchfulness. He clashed with Elias over patrol routes, his frustration boiling over. "We're running ourselves ragged garden strangers," Caleb snapped one evening as they oiled harnesses in the barn. While whoever did that, he jerked his head towards the garden, "is sitting in Redemption Creek Logan at us. We should take the fight to them." "And do what, Caleb?" Elias retorted, his voice weary. "Ride into town accusing folks with no proof? Start a war we can't win? Pause right. We watch. We protect what's ours." "Ours?" Caleb scoffed bitterly. "Since when are they ours?" "There's sickness, Elias. That silent one, she ain't right. She knows things, bad things." He lowered his voice, glancing towards the house. "Folks in town are talking. Jed Pike was at the saloon last night, spouting off about how Thorn's harboring a witch. Says that girl's got the mark of the devil, that she called something to kill that rabbit. Says it's just the start." Silas, entering the barn unnoticed, froze at Caleb's words. The rumor was spreading, twisting Ling's strangeness into something malevolent, fueled by Pike's malice and the town's fear. It was a different kind of threat, just as dangerous as a burning brand. 2 days later, the external threat materialized. Silas was checking the fence line near the North Pasture Trail when he saw the rider approaching. Not from town, but cutting across the open range from the direction of the distant mountains. Harlan Teague. He rode easy in the saddle, a long rifle slung across his back, his face shadowed by his hat brim. The scar above his eyebrow seemed to gleam in the weak winter sun. He reined in a respectful distance from Silas, his gaze sweeping over the rancher, then lingering pointedly towards the ranch house. A humorless smile touched his lips. "Thorn, heard you've been having troubles." Silas kept his hand near the colt at his hip. "We manage. Do you now?" Teague's voice was smooth as oil on water. "Heard about your little garden decoration. Nasty business." He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the frozen ground. "Town's buzzing. Folks ain't happy. Jed Pike, he's mighty stirred up. Says that quiet, chinny girl you got, she's bad medicine. Stirring things up." His cold eyes met Silas's. "Bad medicine attracts trouble, Thorn. Makes folks nervous. Nervous folks do reckless things." "You delivering a message, Teague?" Silas asked, his voice dangerously low. "Just observing," Teague shrugged. "Passing on the mood. Folks feel like you brought something unclean onto your land. Something tied to that mark." He tapped his own chest, vaguely where the serpent symbol would be. "Bad history, maybe? Old debts." He paused, letting the insinuation hang. "Might be wise to reconsider your charitable inclinations, for this trouble gets bigger. A lot bigger." He touched the brim of his hat. "Good day, Thorn. Watch your back." He wheeled his horse and rode off at a leisurely pace, back towards the distant smudge of Redemption Creek. Silas watched him go, Teague's words coiling around him like smoke. Bad history, old debts, the mark. It felt like Teague knew more than he was saying, hinting at a connection between the serpent, the ranch's past, and the danger now swirling around them. Was it just manipulation, Or did it tie back to the jade bracelet and the untranslated letter hidden in his room? The encounter left Silas deeply unsettled. The threat wasn't just anonymous notes and mutilated animals. It had a face, a voice, and a knowing smirk. He rode back to the ranch, the weight of the tin, the rumors and Teague's veiled warnings pressing down on him. He found Ling alone in the kitchen, sorting seeds. She looked up as he entered, her gaze sharp, questioning. Did she sense his turmoil? Later that afternoon, seeking a task to quiet his mind, Silas decided to clear the old ice house near the base of the cliff. It was a damp, seldom used stone structure, half buried in the hillside. He pried open the heavy wooden door, the smell of cold earth and long melted ice washing over him. He lit a lantern, the feeble light pushing back the gloom to reveal stacked, empty barrels and discarded tools. As he moved deeper, preparing to drag out a rusted plow blade, his boot kicked something small and metallic. It skittered across the stone floor with a clatter. He bent, picking it up. It was a button, brass, tarnished, etched with an intricate knot design, identical to the one Jonah had found near the tack room after the crate fell. His blood ran cold. 2 buttons, same unusual design, found near 2 separate, unsettling events, the disturbance revealing the serpent tin, and now here, in this isolated ice house. Had the intruder been here too, searching for something, or leaving another sign? He pocketed the button, the icy dread intensifying. He lifted the lantern higher, its light reaching the back wall of the ice house. And there, scratched into the damp stone, almost obscured by shadow and grime, was another symbol. Cruder than the others, older, weathered by time and moisture, but unmistakable, a serpent coiled, just like the one on the bloody earth, on the tin, on the jade bracelet. A mark hidden in the bones of hollow rock itself. He was still staring at it, the lantern light trembling in his hand when a sound reached him. Not a crack, not a scream. This was the rhythmic, unmistakable beat of multiple horses approaching the ranch at speed. Not Teague's solitary, menacing pace. This sounded like a group. Riding hard, Silas extinguished the lantern instantly, plunging the ice house into near darkness. He pressed himself against the cold stone wall near the door, listening. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer, accompanied by the jingle of tack and rough, raised voices. They weren't stopping at the gate. They were coming right into the yard. He drew his Colt, the metal cold and familiar in his grip. His mind raced. Teague, Pike, a mob from Redemption Creek, spurred by the witch rumors and Teague's poison. Had the reckless things already begun? He edged towards the narrow opening of the ice house door, peering out into the fading afternoon light. 5 riders reined up sharply in the center of the yard, kicking up a spray of gravel. They weren't townsfolk. They were hard-looking men, dressed in thick, trail-worn coats, their faces obscured by scars pulled high against the cold. They carried rifles openly. At their head sat a man with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, but Silas caught the glint of dark, narrowed eyes scanning the ranch house and barn with predatory intent. One of the men pointed towards the house. Another dismounted, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. The leader remained in his saddle, his gaze sweeping the outbuildings, the cliff face, finally settling on the closed door of the ice house where Silas stood hidden in shadow. The man's head tilted slightly, as if listening or sensing. A cold certainty settled over Silas. They weren't here for the town's grudge. They were looking for something specific, or someone. His fingers tightened on the Colt. Inside the house were 3 terrified girls, his sons scattered across the ranch, and a secret serpent etched into the stone behind him. The riders shifted, spreading out slightly, blocking the paths to the house and barn. The dismounted man took a step towards the ranch house door. The leader's hand slowly rose, a silent signal. Silas braced himself against the icy stone, the brass button digging into his palm. The fragile piece of hollow rock was about to shatter. The cold stone of the ice house wall seeped through Silas Thorne's coat, a counterpoint to the icy dread solidifying in his chest. 5 riders, hard men, faces masked against the cold, rifles prominent. Their leader's gaze, sharp and assessing, had swept past the house, the barn, and lingered a fraction too long on the ice house door. They weren't a random patrol. They were hunting. Inside the ranch house, he knew, May would be marshaling Shio and Ling towards the root cellar or the heavy oak cupboard beneath the stairs. Elias, if he'd heard the riders from the barn, will be moving cautiously, likely arming himself. Caleb? Silas couldn't predict Caleb's reaction, rage or reckless action. Jonah, gentle Jonah, would be terrified for the girls. The weight of the brass button in Silas's pocket felt like an accusation. 2 buttons, 2 disturbances. What connected the tack room and this ice house? What were these men after? The dismounted rider took another step towards the ranch house door, hand resting on his holstered revolver. The leader, still mounted, raised his hand again, not to signal an attack, but to halt his man. His voice, when it came, cut through the tense silence like a knife, carrying easily to Silas's hiding place. It was deep, gravelly, devoid of regional accent, a voice used to command. Thorne, Silas Thorne, show yourself. No answer came from the house. The leader's gaze swept the yard again. We know you're here. We saw your smoke. Come out peaceful and we talk. Make us wait. Things get less peaceful. He paused, letting the threat hang in the frigid air. We ain't here for trouble with the law, just for what's ours. Ours. The word echoed the serpent symbols hidden in the ranch's bones. Silas's hand tightened on the worn grip of his Colt. He couldn't stay hidden. They'd search the ice house, find the serpent carving on the wall, maybe worse. He had to draw their focus. He took a slow, silent breath, then pushed the ice house door open just wide enough to step out, his own rifle held loosely but visibly at his side. He kept his back to the cold stone, the door shielding his flank. I'm here, Silas called, his voice steady despite the hammering in his ribs. State your business. He kept his eyes on the leader, noting the man's stillness, the calculating tilt of his head beneath the wide brim. The leader nudged his horse forward a few steps. The other riders shifted, forming a loose half-circle, their weapons trained not directly on Silas, but covering the approaches. Business is simple, Thorne, the leader stated. You got something that belongs to us. We want it back. You hand it over, we ride out. No fuss. His dark eyes, barely visible in the shadow of his hat, held no warmth. I run cattle, Silas replied flatly. Not a trading post. Don't have anything of yours. He scanned the masked faces, searching for familiarity, finding none. Jedediah Pike wouldn't hire men like this. He'd stir a mob. Harlan Teague? Teague might know men like this, but this felt bigger, more focused. A harsh laugh came from one of the flanking riders. The leader silenced him with a glance. Not cattle, Thorne. Something smaller, older, carries a mark, a snake. He traced a slow circle in the air with his gloved finger. Coiled, Silas felt the blood drain from his face. The serpent, the tin, the jade bracelet, the carving, it all pulsed behind his eyes. Ling's face, her silent intensity, flashed in his mind. Did she carry the mark? Or the object itself? What's ours? He forced his expression to remain impassive, stone. Seen snakes, rattlers mostly, killed him when they got too close to the house. The leader's gaze sharpened, boring into Silas. He didn't believe the evasion. Don't play dumb. We know it's here. Been looking for a long time. Belonged to a man, misplaced it years back. We aim to return it. His patience is wearing thin. There was an undercurrent of real menace in the words, a history Silas couldn't fathom. Hand it over. The girl can keep the trinket she carries, if she likes. We just want the box. The girl. They knew about Ling. And the box, the serpent tin. A cold fury warred with Silas's fear. They spoke of Ling like property, just like Pike had at the auction. "No girls here belong to you," Silas stated, his voice low and dangerous. "And I don't have your box. You're wasting your time." Before the leader could respond, the ranch house door creaked open. Elias stood framed in the doorway, his own rifle held ready, his face set in grim lines. He'd positioned himself carefully, half hidden by the door jamb. "You heard my pa," Elias called, his voice tight with controlled tension. "Right on." The leader barely glanced at Elias, his focus locked on Silas. "Wrong answer, Thorn." He made a subtle gesture with his chin. The dismounted rider, the one nearest the house, took another step towards the porch, his hand now firmly gripping his pistol butt. "Stop right there." The command didn't come from Silas or Elias. It came from May. She stood just behind Elias, visible now in the doorway, her small frame rigid with defiance. Her eyes blazed, fixed on the approaching rider. She held no weapon, only her fierce will. "You come closer, you bring trouble." Her accented English rang clear in the frozen air. The rider paused, surprised. A flicker of amusement crossed the leader's face. "Spirited little thing, ain't she? Like the one we're looking for." His gaze slid past May, searching the dim interior behind her. "Where is she? The quiet one? She knows what we want." Inside, huddled with Shio in the cramped space beneath the stairs, Ling flinched as if struck. Shio whimpered, burying her face in Ling's sleeve. Ling's hand closed around the serpent carving in her pocket, the wood smooth and cold. A wave of dizziness washed over her, accompanied by a faint, high-pitched ringing in her ears, like the echo of a scream long silenced. It wasn't fear of the men outside. It was the resonance of the mark, the serpent symbol etched into the icehouse wall nearby, vibrating with their presence. A shadow seemed to flicker at the edge of her vision, near the small gap in the stair riser. Not a physical shadow, but a deeper darkness, cold and ancient. It whispered without sound, a feeling of dread that tightened her chest. Danger. Old danger. She squeezed Shio tighter, her breath catching. The dismounted rider, regaining his composure, sneered at May. "Out of the way, girlie." He took another step onto the bottom porch stair. A rifle shot cracked the air, not aimed at the man, but into the frozen dirt at his feet, kicking up a spray of gravel. Caleb stood near the corner of the barn, his rifle smoking, his face pale but set in furious lines. "Next one, center mass," he yelled, his voice cracking slightly but laced with conviction. The unexpected defiance, even from the resentful son, startled the riders. Their horses sidestepped nervously. Silas saw his chance. "You got your answer," he roared, leveling his own rifle now, centering the bead on the leader's chest. "You ride out now? Where you start a fight, you won't finish clean. My boys know this land. You're exposed." He gestured with his chin toward the high bluffs flanking the yard. "How many rifles you think are sighted on you right now?" It was a bluff, but a desperate one. Elias and Caleb were positioned, but Jonah was likely still inside, unarmed. The leader stared at Silas, his expression unreadable beneath the scarf and hat brim. The dismounted rider froze, glancing back at his boss. The tension stretched, brittle as ice. The wind moaned around the eaves of the house, carrying the faint scent of snow and gunpowder. Finally, the leader chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Bluff or not, Thorn, you got grit. I'll give you that." He slowly raised his gloved hands, palms out, a mockery of peace. "All right, we ride. For now." His dark eyes held Silas's. "But understand this. We will be back. That box and the knowledge that girl carries, they belong to the man I represent. He don't forget. He don't forgive. And he don't quit." He lowered his hands. "Tell the quiet one, the serpent remembers. It always finds its own." He wheeled his horse sharply. "Move out." The riders turned as one, kicking their horses into a brisk trot. They didn't gallop. maintaining a menacing control as they rode back the way they came, towards a distant trail leading not directly to Redemption Creek, but deeper into the wilderness. The dismounted rider scrambled onto his horse and followed. Silas didn't lower his rifle until the last rider disappeared into the gray landscape. His arm trembled with the release of tension. Elias emerged fully from the house, rifle still raised, scanning the departing riders. Caleb lowered his weapon, his hands visibly shaking now, his earlier bravado replaced by a sickly pallor. May stepped onto the porch, her defiance giving way to a profound trembling she couldn't suppress. Inside, Jonah helped Ling and a sobbing show out from under the stairs. Silas holstered his Colt, the brass button in his pocket feeling like a burning coal. He looked towards the ice house, then back at the terrified faces of his makeshift family. The leader's words echoed. The serpent remembers. It always finds its own. It wasn't just about the tin. It was about Ling. They knew her. They wanted what she knew, what she carried. He walked toward the house, his steps heavy. Elias met him at the porch steps. "Who were they, Pa?" Elias asked, his voice low and shaken. "What box? What serpent?" Silas shook his head, the weight of secrets crushing him. "Trouble," he rasped. "Deep trouble." He looked past Elias to where Ling stood in the doorway, supported by Jonah. Her face was ghostly pale, her eyes huge and dark, fixed not on Silas, but on the closed door of the ice house. She looked like she'd seen a ghost, or felt one. Jonah gently guided Ling and Shio towards the warmth of the kitchen stove. May followed, casting a last, wary glance at the empty horizon. Caleb lingered near the barn, staring at the ground where his shot had kicked up dirt, his expression a turmoil of fear and lingering resentment. Silas climbed the porch steps, his mind churning. He needed to see that letter again. He needed to understand the symbols carved into his land. He needed to know what Ling knew. He entered the house, the familiar smells of wood smoke and beans now laced with the acrid scent of fear. He avoided the questioning looks, heading straight for his bedroom. He knelt by the loose floorboard, his fingers numb. He pulled out the serpent tin, its cold metal biting his skin. He broke the wax seal once more, carefully unfolding the yellowed paper covered in elegant Chinese script. He stared at the unintelligible characters, symbols holding the key to the danger now stalking them. He picked up the jade bracelet, the interlocking serpents cool against his palm. The serpent remembers. A soft footfall made him freeze. He looked up. Ling stood in the doorway of his room, her dark eyes fixed not on him, but on the open tin and the jade bracelet in his hand. There was no surprise in her gaze, only a deep, weary recognition, and something else, a flicker of desperate hope. She took a single step into the room, her hand emerging from her pocket. Not clenched this time, but open. Resting on her palm was the small, polished serpent carving. She looked from her carving to the jade bracelet in Silas's hand, then lifted her gaze to meet his. For the first time, she spoke. Her voice was a whisper, thin and strained, like wind through dead grass, but clear. "I can read." The whisper hung in the cold air of Silas Thorne's bedroom, fragile as the pressed flower inside the open tin. "I can read." Ling's voice, unused and strained, held a quiet certainty that cut through the lingering dread of the rider's departure. Her dark eyes, wide and fixed on the jade bracelet in Silas's hand, held no deceit, only a profound weariness and a flicker of desperate hope. Silas slowly lowered the bracelet back into the tin, his gaze never leaving hers. The brass button dug in his palm where he clenched his fist. The serpent remembered. It wanted its own. And Ling, this silent girl he'd brought into his broken world, held the key. He gestured towards a yellowed paper covered in elegant script. "This? You understand this." Ling took another hesitant step into the room, her serpent carving still resting on her open palm. She nodded, her gaze shifting to the paper. "It is my grandfather's hand, The revelation struck Silas like a physical blow. Her grandfather, the tin, hidden for decades in the tack room wall, belonged to her family. The serpent wasn't just a symbol. It was a legacy, a burden she carried. He carefully lifted the paper, holding it out. What does it say? Why is it here? Ling approached, her movements silent. She took the paper with reverence, her slender fingers tracing the faded characters. Her brow furrowed in concentration, the mask of stillness replaced by deep focus. She began to read, her voice gaining a fraction more strength, translating the flowing script in a halting English. It speaks of a journey, she began. A great journey across the ocean. Many men from our village. Seeking Gold Mountain. Promises. A shadow crossed her face. Promises broken. The man who brought them, he bore the serpent mark. A brotherhood. Powerful. They took much. Wages. Freedom. Her fingers stopped on a cluster of characters. My grandfather, he was learned. He kept records. The brotherhood, they did not like records. They feared truth. She looked up, her eyes meeting Silas's. He hid the truth. Here, in this place. He spoke of a ranch built near a red cliff. Hollow rock. He helped build it. He hid the box the serpents eyed before they took him away. Her voice cracked. He never came back. The serpent's eye? Silas prompted, his mind reeling. The jade bracelet? The carving? Ling pointed to the intricate serpent carving on the bracelet. It is part of it. The eye sees. The brotherhood, they use it. To mark what is theirs. To find. She touched her own small carving. It was his. My father's. He gave it to me before. She trailed off, the memory too painful. The brotherhood, they look for the box. For the record. To bury the truth. Forever. The pieces crashed together in Silas's mind. The hidden tin wasn't just a keepsake. It was evidence. Evidence of exploitation, of crimes committed against men like Ling's grandfather who built this very ranch. The Serpent Brotherhood, the powerful man the riders served, wanted it destroyed. And Ling, bearing her grandfather's carving and likely his knowledge, was a target. Hollow Rock wasn't just a refuge. It was the hiding place of her family's secret, guarded unknowingly by Margaret's unease and now by Silas's grief-turned protection. A cold wind rattled the window pane, carrying the faint scent of snow and pine, but also, for a fleeting second, the dry, ancient smell of dust and forgotten pain. Ling shivered, her gaze darting towards the corner of the room where shadows seemed to deepen momentarily. She clutched her carving tighter. "We need to," Silas began, but a frantic shout from outside cut him off. "Pa, riders, coming fast from town." It was Elias, his voice sharp with alarm. Silas snatched up his rifle, the letter and tin momentarily forgotten. "Stay here," he commanded Ling, but she was already moving towards the door, her face set. He didn't stop her. Knowledge was her weapon now. They burst into the main room. Jonah was helping a trembling Shio towards the relative safety near the heavy hearth. They stood near the window, peering out, her jaw clenched. Caleb stood frozen near the door, Elias beside him, both staring out at the yard. Not the mysterious riders from the wilderness. This was a mob from Redemption Creek. A dozen men on horseback and a few on foot, led by Jedediah Pike on a nervous gelding. Harlan Teague rode, slightly apart, his expression unreadable, but his presence was a dark punctuation mark. They carried torches despite the gray afternoon, their flames casting jumping, malevolent shadows on the snow-dusted ground. Pike's face was flushed with self-righteous fury. "Thorn," Pike bellowed, his voice carrying the false preacher's boom. "You harbor an evil in there. That witch girl. We seen the signs. The dead creature. The mark. Send her out. Send them all out. Cleanse this land. May whirled from the window, fire in her eyes. We are not witches. You are the evil, hateful snakes." Her voice cracked with fury and fear. Caleb flinched at her words, his gaze flicking between the mob and Ling, who stood silent and pale beside Silas. He saw the tiny serpent carving still clutched in her hand. Pike's words, Teague's insinuations, warred with the image of the terrified girls and the chilling story Ling had just shared. Silas stepped onto the porch, rifle held ready. Elias moved to his right, his own weapon leveled. Jonah positioned himself near the door, a pitchfork held in white-knuckled hands. May stood defiantly just inside the threshold, pulling Shio behind her. Ling remained beside Silas, her stillness radiating a different kind of strength. The cold air bit at exposed skin. "Get off my land, Pike," Silas stated, his voice low and dangerous, carrying over the nervous shuffling of horses. "There's no witch here, just folks you try to sell like cattle." Pike sneered. "She brought the devil's mark thorn, stirred up spirits. That dead rabbit was a warning, a sign of her power. Hand her over, and the others go back where they belong, or we burn the evil out." He brandished his torch. A murmur of agreement rose from the men behind him. Teague remained silent, watchful, his eyes scanning the ranch house windows, the barn, lingering on Ling. "They belong here now," Silas said, the words solid as stone. "My family. You touch them, you touch me." He raised the rifle slightly. "You think fire scares me? I lost everything worth burning already." Margaret's face flashed in his mind, not with sorrow now, but with a fierce love that fueled his resolve. "Try it." A tense silence fell, broken only by the crackle of torches and the wind sighing through the pines. The mob hesitated, confronted by the grim determination on the porch. Silas and Elias with their rifles, Jonah with his pitchfork, May's defiant glare, and Ling's unnerving stillness. Pike looked uncertain, his bluster momentarily checked. He glanced at Teague, seeking support. Teague nudged his horse forward a step. "Thorn's right about one thing, Jed," he drawled, his voice oily. "Burning's messy, leaves evidence. But that girl," he pointed a gloved finger directly at Ling, "she's trouble. Bad blood. Her kind brings curses. Maybe just hand her over. Settle the town's nerves. Keep the others." His cold eyes held Silas's. Practical solution. The suggestion hung in the air, vile and insidious. Divide them. Offer a sacrifice. Silas saw the calculation in Teague's eyes, the desire to appease the mob while isolating the most dangerous piece, Ling and her knowledge. Before Silas could respond, Caleb moved. Not towards the mob, not towards Ling. He stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Ling, between her and Teague's pointing finger. His face was pale, etched with the conflict that had raged within him, but his voice, when he spoke, was surprisingly steady. "You don't touch her," Caleb stated, looking not at Teague, but at his father. Then he turned his gaze, burning with a newfound, desperate conviction, towards the mob. "Any of them. They're under thorn roof." He raised the rifle he'd been clutching, its barrel trembling slightly, but aimed squarely at the space between Pike and Teague. "You want her, Harlan? You come through me first." It wasn't just protection. It was an acknowledgement, a claim. Found family, forged in the crucible of shared threat. The defiance, coming from the previously hostile son, was a shockwave. Pike gaped. Teague's smirk vanished, replaced by cold fury. A ripple of unease went through the mob. Elias shifted his aim subtly towards Teague. Jonah tightened his grip on the pitchfork. May's hand found Shio's, squeezing tightly. Ling, standing behind Caleb, looked at his back, then down at the serpent carving in her hand. A faint, almost imperceptible sigh seemed to whisper through the room, not from the wind, but from the ancient wood itself. A shadow, deeper than the others, seemed to coalesce near Caleb for a heartbeat. A fleeting impression of a coiled shape, watchful, protective, then dissolved. Ling closed her eyes briefly, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. Not fear, relief, acceptance. Teague's hand hovered near his holster. The air crackled with the promise of violence. One twitch, one shout, and the yard would erupt. Hold! A new voice, thin and reedy but laced with authority, cut through the tension. An older man on a mule pushed his way through the back of the mob. Silas recognized him. Old Man Henderson, who ran the dry goods store, a man known more for pragmatism than prejudice. Jedediah Pike, you fool. You aim to start a range war over superstitious nonsense? Over girls. Henderson's sharp eyes scanned the grim tableau on the porch. Thorne's got rights to who he houses. You bring fire here. You bring the marshal down on all our heads. And for what? Scared of a quiet girl and a dead rabbit? Disperse. Now, before blood's spilled, nobody can clean up. Henderson's pragmatic intervention broke the mob's feverish momentum. Murmurs rose, men looking at each other, at their torches, suddenly aware of the precipice. Pike spluttered, deflating. Teague glared at Henderson, then at Silas, his gaze lingering venomously on Ling. The promise in his eyes was clear. This isn't over. But the immediate threat was dissipating. Fine, Pike spat, humiliation turning his face purple. But mark my words, Thorne, the devil you harbor will turn on you. This ain't done. He yanked his horse's head around. Back to town. Let the cursed land have him. Reluctantly, grumbling, the mob began to turn. Torches were lowered. Teague cast one last, long look at Ling, a look that promised future reckoning, before wheeling his horse and melting back with the others. The thunder of hooves faded, leaving behind an eerie silence and the smell of smoke and fear. Silas slowly lowered his rifle, his limbs trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. Elias did the same, slumping against the porch post. Jonah lowered the pitchfork, his breath coming in ragged gasps. May pulled Shio into a fierce hug, the younger girl trembling violently but silent. Caleb lowered his rifle, his shoulders slumping, the bravado draining away to reveal profound exhaustion. He didn't look at Ling, but his stance, shielding her, remained. Ling stepped forward, not towards Caleb but towards Silas. She held out her hand, not the carving this time, but the serpent tin. The truth, it should stay hidden? Or, her voice was barely a whisper. Silas looked at the tin, then at the faces of his sons, at the girls. May's fierce protectiveness, Shio's fragility, Ling's quiet strength. He saw Margaret's compassion reflected in their resilience, in his fragile family forged from loss and defiance. It stays, he said firmly, hidden, but known, by us. He took the tin. This ranch, it holds secrets. Now it holds you, all of you. He looked at his sons. Elias nodded, a slow understanding dawning. Jonah managed a small, shaky smile toward Shio. Caleb finally turned, his eyes meeting Ling's. There was no apology, but the hostility was gone, replaced by a wary, exhausted acceptance. He gave a single, curt nod. Months passed. The harsh winter reluctantly surrendered to a tentative spring. The threat from Redemption Creek simmered, but didn't boil over again. Henderson's words and the memory of the Thorns' united stand held the worst at bay. Harlan Teague vanished from the area, but the memory of his cold promise lingered like a chill in the shadows. The Serpent Brotherhood remained a distant, ominous specter, a storm cloud on the horizon. Life at Hollow Rock Ranch settled into a new, hard-worn rhythm. May worked alongside Elias with a fierce determination, her earlier defiance channeled into rebuilding a corral wall, her voice often raised in spirited debate over ranch tasks that made Elias, initially exasperated, eventually crack rare smiles. A mutual respect, born of shared labor and the memory of standing shoulder to shoulder against the mob, slowly deepened into something warmer, something unspoken but understood. Plans for a simple homestead wedding in the fall began to take shape, whispered about during evening chores. Jonah and Shio found solace in the gentler tasks. Shio, though still easily startled, followed Jonah like a shadow as he tended the recovering vegetable garden or cared for the horses. Her smiles, when they came, were like sunlight breaking through clouds, and Jonah's quiet patience nurtured a fragile courage in her. He spoke to her softly, teaching her English words for plants and animals, and she began to tentatively string sentences together, her voice losing its constant tremor. Their bond was a quiet sanctuary. Ling remained mostly silent, but her silence was no longer a wall. She worked with meticulous care, preserving food, mending with invisible stitches, her watchful eyes now often holding a thoughtful depth. She spent hours with Jonah, not just with Xiao, but sharing knowledge of herbs she recognized from the high meadows, pointing out edible roots he'd overlooked. She avoided the tack room and the ice house, but sometimes Silas would catch her standing near Margaret's overgrown rose bush at dusk, her head tilted as if listening to the wind. Once, Jonah mentioned she told him the purple flower pressed in the letter was called Nostalgia Bloom in her village. Caleb kept his distance, but the sharp edge of his resentment had dulled. He worked the high pastures alone, but he no longer protested the extra plate at the table. He watched May and Elias, Jonah and Xiao, with a complex expression Silas couldn't quite decipher. Part loneliness, part grudging acceptance. Sometimes, Silas caught him watching Ling, not with suspicion, but with a troubled curiosity. The shadow he'd shielded her from had marked him too. One cool spring evening, they gathered around the larger table Silas and Elias had built to accommodate everyone. The smell of stew and fresh bread filled the room. May ladled portions, her movements confident. Xiao carefully placed a woven basket of bread rolls in the center, a small, proud smile on her face. Jonah passed a bowl to Ling, who accepted it with a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Elias poured water. Caleb sat at the end, quieter than the others, but present. Silas looked around the table, at the faces illuminated by the warm glow of the kerosene lamp. Grief for Margaret was a permanent ache, a hollow space, but it no longer consumed him. It was filled now, not replaced, but accompanied by the fierce resilience of May, the quiet wisdom of Ling, the tentative light of Xiao, the steady strength of Elias, the growing empathy of Jonah, and even the conflicted presence of Caleb. They were a patchwork family, stitched together by necessity, trauma, and a shared defiance against a harsh world. Ling raised her head, her dark eyes meeting Silas's across the table. In their depths, he saw the echo of the serpent, the weight of the past, the fear of the brotherhood still lurking. But he also saw something new, a fragile sense of belonging, a cautious trust. She gave no smile, but the tightness around her eyes softened almost imperceptibly. She glanced at Jonah, who offered her a quiet, encouraging look, then back at Silas. Her hand brushed the pocket where her small carving rested. Outside, the wind sighed around the eaves of Hollow Rock Ranch, carrying the scent of thawing earth and distant pines. Somewhere, far away, a wolf howled, a lonely sound, but also a testament to survival. Inside, the lamp flickered, casting long, protective shadows on the walls. The serpent was remembered. Danger still waited beyond the cliffs. But here, around this table, in this hard-won circle of light and shared silence, a different kind of strength had taken root. It was brittle, tested, and far from safe, but it was theirs. Silas Thorne picked up a spoon. The meal, like the future, was simple, uncertain, but shared. They ate,